They were told they were being sent to a camp, a word that carried with it all the shadows of defeat. The convoy moved slowly through the Rhode Island mist, the air thick with the metallic taste of salt and exhaust. Inside the rattling truck, a dozen German women, nurses, clerks, translators, secretaries of a lost Reich, sat in silence, their gray uniforms wrinkled, their eyes hollow with exhaustion and fear. Most had not spoken since the surrender. Their world had collapsed, and they expected their captors to mirror the cruelty of their own commanders. But as the trucks turned past a gate marked U.S. Naval Construction Battalion Center, Quonset Point, the women gasped. What they saw was not the razor wire they feared, but rows upon rows of gleaming metal huts, curving like half-moons across the American earth. The sight was almost surreal. Each structure shimmered in the morning light, arched, symmetrical, and endless. Some smoked gently from their stovepipes. Others had laundry hanging outside, fluttering in the sea breeze like white flags of truce. One of the younger women, barely 20, whispered, "Es sieht aus wie ein Stadt aus Dosen." It looks like a city made of cans. A wave of uneasy laughter rippled through the truck. For the first time in months, their fear wavered, replaced by something unfamiliar, curiosity. When they were ordered out, the ground beneath their boots was dry gravel, not mud. American soldiers, young, sunburned, almost casually kind, handed them canteens of water and packets of cigarettes. The oldest woman among them, Greta Mahler, a former army nurse with silver hair hidden under a kerchief, accepted one but did not smoke. She watched the curved buildings with a surgeon's cold attention, noting the clean lines, the deliberate repetition. "No wasted effort," she murmured. "They build as if time is their ally, not their enemy." The Quonset hut, named after the very place they stood, was the offspring of both urgency and ingenuity. Conceived in 1941 by Navy engineers and MIT architects, its design was deceptively simple. Corrugated steel ribs, bolted together, covered in galvanized sheets that curved into a perfect half-circle. Light yet strong. Cheap yet enduring. A hut that could be shipped flat across the ocean and raised by 6 men in 6 hours. The Americans built more than 100,000 of them during the war, spreading their silver shells from the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of the Pacific. They rose like a metallic crop wherever U.S. forces went, proof that logistics, not glory, wins wars. For the women, that revelation struck deeper than humiliation. Here, on foreign soil, they were seeing the architecture of an idea, the quiet efficiency of a nation that fought with factories as much as with guns. Greta had spent years tending to soldiers in shattered field hospitals, patching up the broken machinery of war. Now she stood before buildings that looked indestructible. "Even their shelters are confident," she muttered. The younger ones, Anna and Lotte, exchanged glances but said nothing. The smell of oil, sawdust, and seaweed filled the air. Somewhere nearby, an American radio played swing music, carefree and defiant, the sound of a world that had already moved on. Inside the hut assigned to them, light poured through small rectangular windows. The interior smelled faintly of tar and soap. Wooden floors, cots lined in neat rows, blankets folded with military precision. For prisoners, it was unthinkably clean. Anna touched the wall, feeling the cool vibration of the wind outside. "It hums," she said softly, as if the structure itself were alive. Lotte laughed, perhaps to hide the lump in her throat. "Even our prisons are lucky to be American," she whispered, and Greta shot her a look that was half warning, half agreement. That night, lying on her cot, Greta listened to the creak of metal and the rhythmic breathing of the women around her. Through the small window, she could see the huts glimmering under the moon, identical, infinite, serene. She thought of the ruins back home, the cities swallowed by fire, the hospitals turned to ash. She thought of the American engineers who had drawn this curve, not for beauty but for purpose. There was no arrogance in it, only function, and somehow that made it beautiful. She wondered if that was the secret, to build not for power, but for endurance. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of chores and waiting. The women scrubbed floors, washed linens, and prepared rations. They learned the names of the guards, who were impossibly polite, some even cracked jokes. One soldier named Harris, who couldn't have been older than 20, showed them how to adjust the stove when the metal walls got too hot. "Built to keep you warm, not roast you," he laughed. Greta noted how his humor softened the edges of captivity. It was hard to hate a man who whistled while fixing your fire. And yet, beneath that uneasy peace, something transformative was unfolding. The women began to mimic their captors, tidying the huts with American precision, folding their clothes the same way, even humming their songs. The huts, once symbols of imprisonment, became small sanctuaries of order in a world of chaos. Each curved roof seemed to cradle them against the winds of guilt and memory. At dusk, the ocean wind would sweep through Quonset Point, whistling through the gaps in the steel, carrying the scent of salt and smoke. Anna often stood outside then, eyes on the horizon, the silhouettes of the huts forming a strange cathedral of repetition. "They all look the same," she told Greta one evening. "But somehow, none of them feel like cages." Greta didn't reply. She only watched the sun dip behind the silver domes, the light bending gently across the curves, soft as forgiveness. What began as humiliation was quietly turning into revelation. The huts were more than shelters, they were statements. Each one whispered the same defiance, that even in war, life demanded structure, order, and a place to rest. The women began to feel it too, that under these curved roofs, something was rebuilding them. The enemy had given them roofs of mercy, and in their strange simplicity, the women saw a truth their own leaders had buried under monuments of stone and pride. By the time spring arrived, the sound of construction filled the air again. New huts were rising, dozens more, each piece bolted with speed and grace. Greta stood watching one afternoon as the final sheet of steel was laid into place. The sun caught it perfectly, turning it into a mirror. For a brief moment, she saw her own reflection distorted by the curve, familiar yet changed. She didn't know then that these huts would outlive the war itself, that their design would spread across continents and generations. She only knew this: the architecture of her captors had outlasted the ideology of her homeland. And as the wind sighed through the steel, she realized she was witnessing something greater than victory. She was seeing the shape of the future, bent, simple, and unbreakably human. The war ended, but the huts remained, silent as old sentinels beneath the Atlantic wind. Greta Mahler awoke one morning in the same curved room that had once held her as a prisoner. The guards were gone now, the fences dismantled, and yet she stayed. The Americans had asked for volunteers to assist with post-war relief, and Greta, who had nowhere to return to, signed her name with the shaky resolve of someone trying to make amends to history. Outside, the Quonset hut stretched toward the sea, still shining with that impossible steel light. But their purpose had changed. They were no longer shelters for soldiers or prisoners. They were becoming homes. By 1946, families of veterans had begun arriving, young wives, infants, and men still limping from Europe's wounds. The huts filled again, not with fear, but with laughter, arguments, and the sound of life returning. Greta helped distribute blankets and soup, her nurse's hands steady as ever. Sometimes she caught her reflection in a tin pot or a polished window and hardly recognized herself. Her gray hair had thinned, but her eyes had softened. The Americans called her Miss Greta now, and the children adored her. She was, to them, a grandmotherly figure in a world rebuilding itself one nail at a time. The transformation of Quonset Point mirrored the transformation of its people. The very huts that once symbolized control and captivity became monuments of generosity. Across the world, from Okinawa to Hamburg, from Cairo to Kansas, they were rising again, reborn as schools, hospitals, and churches. Each identical arch carried with it the same quiet declaration: survival through simplicity. Greta received a letter from Anna, one of the younger women she'd shared the barracks with. Anna was in Hamburg now, teaching in a makeshift classroom built from salvaged Quonset panels. Her words trembled across the page. The children draw on the walls. They call it the Rainbow House because when the sun hits the steel, it shines. Greta pressed the paper to her lips and wept softly. She understood then that the huts were more than architecture. They were a language. They spoke of practicality in the face of ruin, of a civilization that preferred function over fury. For a woman raised under banners of perfection and conquest, it was a revelation. The Americans had built something honest, not marble monuments to their glory, but curved shells that simply worked. And in that simplicity lay a kind of mercy that her generation had never known. One afternoon, a storm rolled in from the ocean, hammering the camp with rain that clattered like bullets on the steel. Greta moved through the rows of huts, checking for leaks, calming frightened children. The wind howled through the gaps in the metal, but the huts held firm, singing their tin hymn to endurance. She paused outside one where a family of 5 huddled around a small stove. The father, a veteran with a missing hand, smiled through the dim orange light. "Never thought I'd call a can home," he said. "But it keeps the rain out, and that's more than most things in this life." Greta smiled back, her throat tight. "It's not a can," she said gently. "It's a circle. It always comes back to you." Later, as the storm broke and a faint rainbow stretched across the horizon, she stood beneath the dripping eaves and felt something stir inside her, a fragile peace she hadn't believed possible. For the first time since the war began, she no longer felt like a guest in someone else's world. She was part of the rebuilding, part of the mercy. The steel walls around her seemed to breathe with her, alive and forgiving. Months passed, and the huts multiplied again, carried by ships to lands Greta would never see. She read in a newspaper that more than 100,000 had been built in total, sheltering missionaries, scientists, and newlyweds across 70 nations. They stood in jungles, deserts, and tundras, stubbornly curved against time. Greta began to imagine them as seeds scattered by the wind, seeds of practicality that grew wherever humans dared to start again. But the camp at Quonset Point was closing. The Navy was moving on, and most of the huts would be dismantled or sold. Greta was offered a chance to return to Germany. She hesitated. The thought of home filled her with both longing and dread. What home? The ruins of her old life were ashes, her family gone. The huts had become her only constant, her confession and her redemption. Yet even mercy, she knew, must eventually move forward. On her final evening, she walked the gravel paths alone. The sunset poured molten gold across the steel, and every curve glowed like the inside of a lantern. She reached out to touch one last time the wall that had sheltered her through defeat and forgiveness. Beneath her palm, the surface was warm, pulsing faintly with the echo of rain and voices long faded. She thought of Anna in Hamburg, of the family she'd tended, of the nameless builders who had designed this shape, the perfect marriage of strength and grace. As the light faded, she whispered, "You were never just a hut, were you?" The wind answered softly, rippling through the endless rows. In that moment, she understood, mercy has architecture. It can be drawn, built, and lived within. It isn't something offered from above, but something raised from the ground by human hands. When dawn came, the trucks waited to take her to the port. Greta climbed aboard, the sea glittering beyond the wire fence that no longer existed. As the convoy moved away, she looked back one last time. The huts stood silent in the mist, their silver arcs catching the sun like halos. They were not prisons, nor monuments. They were echoes of a time when even war could not silence the will to build. Years later, travelers passing through Rhode Island would still find them, rusted, repainted, repurposed, but standing nonetheless. And somewhere across the ocean, a child learning in a rainbow house might look up at the curved ceiling and feel, without knowing why, that there is kindness in structure and hope in the hum of steel. The huts had survived empires, ideologies, and time itself. In their unbroken circles, Greta had glimpsed the future, not grand, not perfect, but merciful. And as the waves crashed against the shore behind her, she carried that mercy with her, an invisible architecture built to last. Which city are you watching our video from? For more powerful stories from World War II, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thank you.